Shout out to Bring Our Q, Julius, you legend. We're going to do a joint interview, yeah? Yeah, we'll do a joint interview, Julius. Thanks for the support. You're a legend. From your girls, Raven and Ellie.
Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news. Ow!
Okay, we'll start with this. It's official. Shakur Stevenson versus Frank Martin for the vacant WBC lightweight world title is now signed and will take place on Thursday, November 16th in Las Vegas, ahead of the first ever Formula One Las Vegas Grand Prix that weekend. Bob Arum has confirmed.
This fight happened at the right time for Shakur, right on time. He wasn't having any luck with Devin, he wasn't having any luck with Loma or George.
Bob Arum a few weeks ago promised that they would get Shakur Stevenson a big fight later on this year, before this year was out, and I think that this is a decent enough fight, decent sized enough.
Another top rank versus PBC kind of fight, another top rank versus PBC kind of deal.
A battle of the unbeatens, a battle of the southpaws, as both Shakur Stevenson and Frank Martin, they're both
southpaws.
Though I think that Shakur Stevenson has a bit more experience boxing southpaws than Frank Martin does. You know, southpaws, they often go into a fight with a tactical advantage. Tactical in the sense that most fighters in boxing, they're orthodox fighters. And what that means is they're more accustomed to boxing other orthodox fighters.
Not southpaws.
If you're a southpaw, that gives you a bit of an advantage, that they're not used to dealing with fighters that lead with their right hand as opposed to their left.
Their opponents.
But what that also means is that the southpaws themselves, they don't encounter very many southpaws either.
Think Errol Spence Jr. versus Terrence Crawford. Errol was a southpaw, but he wasn't used to boxing southpaws. So when Terrence comes out southpaw, he's lost in the sauce.
Could be the situation between Frank Martin and Shakur Stevenson. Shakur, who I think has boxed one or two more southpaws than Frank Martin has.
Shakur already has the stylistic advantage. He seems a more adaptable fighter to me than Frank, but it also helps that he, like Frank, he is a southpaw, so Frank ain't got that to lean on.
Shakur might. I think Shakur has more experience with southpaws. He faced Jamel Herring, then WBO champion, who also happens to be a southpaw, and we know that he does a lot of work with Terrence Crawford in between fights.
The fight is happening at the right time for young Shakur on a Thursday.
That's pretty novel, pretty nuanced. You don't often see boxing matches midweek in this part of the world here in America. Usually, it's on a Saturday night, sometimes a Friday, but usually a Saturday, whereas this fight's going down on a Thursday, which is more customary to see in, say, Japan or even Australia, these midweek fights.
So still a very good one.
However, this news may be distracting people from yet another story that's out there that seems to indicate Vasyl Lomachenko versus George Kambosos could get made and take place in Australia next year, Bob Arum has revealed. Loma is taking time off for what remains of this one, what remains of this year.
2023.
How does this story relate to the other one? Well, Shakur Stevenson was trying to fight Vasyl Lomachenko. He was trying to fight George Kambosos.
He wanted the both of those fights before he landed on this one, and I'm glad that he landed on this one. This is a good fight, the one with Frank Martin.
But you know, the rumor that Vasyl Lomachenko would be facing George Kambosos, that started maybe 3 weeks ago?
That he would be facing George and not Shakur.
A few weeks ago, Shakur Stevenson and George
Kambosos.
Clam Chowder, they were going back and forth on Twitter. And George Kambosos seemed to have been hinting at an upcoming fight with Vasyl Lomachenko following his close points win over Maxie Hughes, quote-unquote win.
He was hinting at it.
Though he didn't say it outright, and Bob Arum denied the rumor. Denied
that fight would be next. Denied that fight was getting worked on.
It was a little over a week ago, about 2.
The fact they're talking about a fight with Loma and Kambosos is nonsense.
Apparently not. That's the latest. But this is what Bob Arum had to say about it about 2 weeks ago.
I met with Biggest before he went off to Poland for the Usyk fight. We tried to make the fight between Shakur and Loma, and Igas told us that Loma's decided he's not fighting again this year. So the fact that they're talking about a fight with Loma and Kambosos is nonsense. Igas would not mislead us, and he told us Loma wants to take the rest of the year off.
And it does appear that Bob was right. He was right about that. it looks like Vasyl Lomachenko will be sitting out what remains of this year, but him fighting George, that bit of it, that's not nonsense.
Now what he's saying is that they're going to fight next year.
Vasyl Lomachenko and George Kambosos, what appears to be a half-truth.
It's a half-truth.
It is true that Vasyl Lomachenko is sitting out the rest of this year, but that doesn't mean he's not fighting George.
Bob called it nonsense.
When the subject was brought up to him 2 weeks ago, Bob called it nonsense. Well, apparently it's not nonsense. Apparently, you guys are working on it for Australia next year. If somebody comes up to me now and they tell me they think Vasyl Lomachenko is skipping out on fighting Shakur, who wanted to fight him.
If somebody comes up to me and says they think Loma's ducking Shakur,
It would be hard to argue against it. I can only deduce that he's taking the quote-unquote loss, the controversial loss to Devin Haney. He's taking it hard, and they want to put him in an easy one. Put him in an easy one first. Maybe before putting him in a fight with Shakur, and the George Kambosos fight would be that fight, would be that easy one. Perhaps Lomachenko versus Kambosos could be for an alphabet title. Perhaps it could, while Shakur Stevenson collects the green belt.
well, he collects a title of his own.
Maybe Lomachenko versus Kambosos could be for the newly vacated WBO title, once it is vacated. And we know that Shakur Stevenson versus Frank Martin, that's for the WBC.
Right.
Now, even though Vasyl Lomachenko's not getting any younger, and perhaps he's not the fighter now that he used to be then, I still think he has enough left in the tank to beat somebody like George Kambosos. In Australia, in America, wherever. He beats George. Based on what I saw from George, in George's last fight, let's be honest, he didn't beat Maxie Hughes.
A southpaw like Vasyl Lomachenko is a southpaw.
He looked lost in the sauce. He looked confused. Opposite the ring, Maxie Hughes. How's he going to look opposite the ring? Vasyl Lomachenko.
Loma's going to beat him.
And then after Shakur Stevenson takes care of business with Frank Martin, Shakur, he's going to beat him. He's going to retire Vasyl Lomachenko. Listen, I ain't got nothing against Loma, but I've long maintained, I feel Shakur Stevenson will be the fighter that not only beats him, but the fighter that retires him.
And what could be a unification match later on next year.
I don't think that Vasyl Lomachenko can fight with the same fire, the same desire that he may have had going into the Devin Haney fight. Devin Haney's unconvincing, controversial victory over him. That had to take something out. That had to dishearten him.
Might be somewhat disillusioned.
He feels he won that fight, and a lot of people agree with him, but maybe he feels he got screwed. Doesn't understand why.
Doesn't trust his instincts as much as he used to.
He's not getting any younger. If you do a fight between him and Shakur next year, he's gonna be older. He's an aging fighter, an aging veteran. I feel that Shakur is better than Devin in every way you can imagine. Better with that base style, better overall.
Better than Devin.
He won't have to rob Vasyl Lomachenko like Devin Haney did. He'll beat him cleanly, and perhaps retire him. Things to think about beyond
this year.
Upstairs in men's middleweight news, Eddie Hearn says Eubank versus Benn talks are already underway for a potential December fight. Eddie Hearn's detractors, his critics, they're not happy about this. I mean, it's not music to their ears that after all this time and all the controversy, it might still happen. And it's still worth a lot of money.
Perhaps more now than before.
It's the biggest fight for Eubank. It's the biggest fight for Benn, Hearn said. Generally, that's a good starting point. We're talking now about a potential December fight. We're looking at some big stadiums for that. I'd be honestly surprised if it doesn't happen.
Most are making light of Conor Benn's ongoing anti-doping fiasco.
Because it hasn't been settled. The matter is not completely sorted. Not yet. But what's not getting brought up enough is that in spite of the controversy, in spite of the banned substances and everything in between, Chris Eubank Jr. is still willing to fight him. It takes two to tango.
Takes two teams, takes two guys to make a fight, but it only takes one to fuck it up.
Just one. And in this situation, the feeling is mutual. This is the biggest fight for Chris Eubank just as much as it's the biggest fight for Conor Benn. Very recently, Frank Warren, when talking about this fight and talking about...
He volunteered Denzel Bentley for a potential Chris Eubank Jr. fight.
And I actually like that fight. I like the idea of Denzel Bentley versus Chris Eubank Jr. in the United Kingdom for what it's worth. If they did make that fight, I think it would sell. I actually think it would do good business, but not better business than the Conor Benn fight.
Chris knows that.
Look, there's conversations to see if Conor Benn fights at the end of September, Hearn said. Orlando is one option. September 30th is another. We're in conversations with the British Boxing Board of Control about that that as well. I would like for him to have a little run out. He's been out of the ring for over a year and a half. It's a massive fight to go into. He's ready to fight anyone, anytime. But I think Benn's trainer, Tony Sims, would prefer Ben have a quick run out. Certainly, in terms of talks for that fight, they're definitely underway. There's work to do, but it's the biggest fight and the biggest opportunity for the both of them. So fingers crossed. Rumors and rumblings about, there's a rumor out there that Ivan Redkach has been offered the Conor Benn fight. I heard something about Blair Cobbs as well.
Just rumors.
But Conor would need a tune-up fight before going into a Chris Eubank Jr. fight. Hearn said they will need to strike a deal by the end of the month in order to properly publicize the fight for December.
Frank's not happy about it.
Is it not good that they're implementing VADA testing on every show now?
Good for them. We do it as well. We have VADA testing. I mean, it's just all he's doing all the time is deflecting. If he's such a big believer in drug-free sport, then why hasn't his fighter, Conor Benn, gone before UCAD or the Border Control for a hearing if he believes in what he's saying? Why does he keep talking about, I'm going to make this fight against Eubank, I'm going to do this, when he's not had a hearing for that second test? Has there been a hearing with anyone for the second test when he was found positive, and was the B sample tested? The answer to that is no, there's not been any hearings for it. No hearing. No one has listened to what or heard why he has that in his body. And he keeps talking about drug-free sport. He's promoting, saying you get found positive and forget about it. Don't have a hearing. Isn't he? Isn't he or not? Why? Go and get the fighters that you found tested positive. Go and have a hearing and let me explain why it's in their system.
Frank Warren seems more bothered about Conor Benn's anti-doping fiasco than Chris Eubank Jr., even though it affects Chris Eubank Jr.
It directly affects Chris Eubank Jr. because he would be the one that's fighting Conor, not Frank, but Frank's the one that's stuck on it.
News at that time seemed to indicate, when all of this first started, that even though Conor Benn tested positive for a banned substance, Chris was still willing to fight him. He was still willing to fight him then. Banned substance, catch weight, and all.
He was still willing to fight him.
And what inferences you can make based on that. This new set of negotiations, I don't believe it will include a catch weight like the previous one did. I think if Conor wants to fight Chris, he's going to have to fight him at a full 160.
That's not the point. The point is that while everybody's stuck on Conor Benn's fiasco from last year, that's not stopping Chris from going through with this. And Chris is his own man. He's autonomous.
He's not a matchroom fighter, and he's not under Eddie Hearn's thumb, or anyone's thumb, really. If he ends up fighting Conor, if he's still talking about that, it's because he wants to. It's because he wants to fight Conor. And he wants to fight Conor because in the UK, that's a mammoth fight.
A massive fight.
And you think Frank Warren, you think Eddie Hearn's competitors are happy about that? You think that's music to their ears? That Eddie Hearn might end up delivering the biggest fight on UK soil this year.
While Frank's prize stallion is off playing dancing bear for the Saudis.
There's angling in association with the Conor Benn versus Chris Eubank Jr. fight. There's always some level of angling and gimmicks, but Fury versus Ngannou is a far more
gimmicky fight than this one is. At least these two guys are boxers. Your guy's boxing a guy that I never even boxed before.
Here in America. Conor Benn versus Chris Eubank Jr. may not be what it is in the United Kingdom, but it doesn't need to be. That fight's a monster, especially behind Chris Eubank Jr.'s performance, his revenge over Liam Smith, and the controversy with Conor.
All that did was make the fight bigger because now they have their own history, irrespective of their fathers. Now Chris and Conor have some backstory.
Nobody's forcing Chris to do this. Chris is doing it because he knows, like I know, like you know, like Frank knows.
This is a huge fight.
He'd prefer it doesn't happen. He'd prefer Chris fight one of his guys, but it's not up to him. It's up to Chris.
Chris wants Conor.
So that's encouraging news for Matchroom on that front, though. Not some others. Per a tweet from Michael Benson, Anthony Joshua versus Deontay Wilder could now be in jeopardy, as Eddie Hearn has said they're exploring other host countries after talks with Saudi Arabia's Skills Challenge Entertainment slowed amid a shift in Saudi boxing management towards the new entity who are staging Tyson Fury versus Francis Ngannou. Hearn said, if we don't get that sorted soon, you'll probably see AJ fight someone else in December.
My thoughts.
It's the way the story reads. This isn't a Team AJ versus Team Wilder thing. This is a Saudi thing. Whatever's going on over there in that region of the world with its investors, because remember, they're the ones paying for the show. They're the ones orchestrating the deal, not Matchroom by themselves.
If there's been a shift in the axis of power over there in that region of the world and who's putting the money up to bring big-time boxing to Saudi, if something has changed...
I'm not sure what, if anything, Matchroom, Team AJ, or Team Wilder, I'm not sure what, if anything, they could do about that.
And as a result?
Eddie Hearn has named Felipe Hergovic and the Andy Ruiz trilogy as possible fights for Anthony in December if the Deontay Wilder fight doesn't get finalized for Saudi. He added that AJ would likely fight outside of the UK in this case, to which Andy Ruiz himself responded, "Let's do this."
I'm not against an Andy Ruiz rubber match because Andy won the first fight emphatically and AJ won the second one emphatically.
Andy knocked AJ out in the first fight. Did a good job, and AJ won a lopsided decision in the rematch. A tiebreaker, there's a precedence for one. There's a precedence for a rubber match.
And Andy's not busy with anything. I'm not as crazy about a Felipe Hergovic fight because a Felipe Hergovic fight would be for IBF interim status, and all that gets you is another Usyk fight.
AJ already lost the first two. What's the point in a trilogy?
If he were to beat Felipe.
Felipe himself, he likely wants his title shot. He wants his world title opportunity, his crack at the apple with Alexander Usyk. So that fight with him and AJ, it seems less realistic to me than a trilogy with Andy. Now, as far as Wilder...
If AJ ends up fighting Andy again as a result of their fight falling apart, he's left out in the cold. No big purses, no big paydays left for Deontay Wilder.
Not in that scenario. Initially, Deontay Wilder's name was attached to a potential Andy Ruiz showdown based on an order from the WBC that came down last year, but Andy Ruiz's financial demands could not be satisfied, and the fight didn't happen.
According to Wilder, Andy priced himself out.
I think that Matchroom would have an easier time satisfying Andy's financial demands more so than the PBC. Andy wants a lot of money every time he gets out there, whether he deserves it or not. And I think that Matchroom can at least get him more of that money here today than the PBC can.
They can get him more money to fight AJ than what he would have made fighting Wilder.
A fight between Anthony and Deontay is by and large a much, much bigger fight than a trilogy with Andy. But if things are moving, shaking, rattling, and rolling over there in Saudi to where something has changed and the fight is not as feasible as it once was, if the axis of power has shifted.
Well, can't Team AJ and Team Wilder just do the fight themselves somewhere else?
Yes, of course they could, but it wouldn't be the same deal structure. It's not the Saudis coming in with a boatload of cash, making a deal for AJ and a separate deal for Wilder.
Deal structure's different.
Be a more conventional deal structure, reliant on the performance of a pay-per-view and its upside to get the fighters the kind of money they're looking for that fight. And that may be less money than the Saudis were willing to put up.
I still think the fight is a huge fight. Saudis or no Saudis.
Still a fight that would do very well at the box office, but because you're relying on what comes in at the box office, the splits, who gets what, who's the A side,
Becomes a harder fight to negotiate.
so it's not looking good for what is supposed to be Anthony Joshua versus Deontay Wilder, and that's unfortunate.